Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr, and with us once again this week is our favorite and only guest host, Jeff Kolb, filling in for Michael Brodkorb.
Such kind words.
In today's episode, we will break down how Minnesota is being viewed on the national stage after the wild 2023 legislative session. We will then break down local party units and how they can impact their parent parties. And then we will welcome our guest for the week, Kyle Potter. Kyle will join us to break down how politics have evolved over the last 10 years, the joys of life as a recovering political reporter, and might even break down some tips for miles and travel as we discuss his new role as editor of Thrifty Traveler. Finally, we'll end the week with our typical tweets of the week and the food fight with Brodkorb and Becky, featuring our guest host, Jeff Kolb, of course, and also including our guest, Kyle Potter. This week, I expect some saucy debate as we cover best of Taco Bell menu items, past and present. We're excited for you to be joining us today. So, Jeff, thank you for joining us on this lovely post-Father's Day week. How was your Father's Day?
It was fantastic. By the way, don't think I missed what you did there with saucy.
Thanks.
I saw. I got it. I got where you went. No, it was a great little Father's Day. I actually put out a tweet last night about, on Sunday about that I was at Menards and actually was wished a happy Father's Day by every female Menards employee that I ran into, which I thought was very kind. It was kind of an unexpected little thing, but the cashier and the lady who helped me find some stuff and the lady who was holding the door on the way out the door. So yeah, it was nice.
That is nice. Do you think there are maybe some snowflakes out there that would feel differently about being assumed to be a father as a man of your age?
Well, I should say I'm sure because somebody's going to be offended by everybody, but I did have my kids in tow, so I think it was fairly obvious.
Hey, there you go.
So was this your son's father's first Father's Day, or have we already gone around the calendar once?
No, this was the first one. The baby's turning 1 in just a couple of weeks here. This is
Oh,
the first one. We started out the day with story time at the brewery. So, dad's drink there, got a drink for free, had a pre-noon cocktail. Can't
who
beat that.
whoever came up with that is a genius, marketing genius.
We've
I
gone to a
like that.
couple other story times at the brewery, and I gotta say, this one blew it out of the water. The amount of families that were there, I'm sure before, so many story time maybe isn't the typical way that a lot of families like to start their Sunday morning. But major father's points, right? You get a free beer before noon,
What's not to like?
right? It was great. All right. So I think if you're ready, let's launch right into it.
Let's do
Our
it.
first topic is a carryover from a couple weeks ago that we didn't get to because we had such a great conversation with Jana instead. We just had to boot it from the schedule. So we're going to break down the national conversation surrounding the recent Minnesota legislative session in the so-called Minnesota Miracle 2.0. So I'm going to start us off here. I'm going to break it down one step further for those of us, like myself, who were maybe a bit confused about this analogy. So, my ignorance, I started out thinking that this was referring to the infamous 61-yard touchdown 2018 playoff games, which I had to look up the year, of course, with Diggs coming in clutch for the Vikings. That apparently is the Minneapolis Miracle. Minnesota Miracle refers to something different. And in my research and conversations here at the office, wow, did this change my perspective on things. So I'm going to regale you all with some of this knowledge. Minnesota Miracle, 1972, Governor Wendell Anderson on the cover of Time magazine, holding a walleye, Minnesota representation in its finest. I got educated a little bit. And so, according to an op-ed that I was reading following Wendell Anderson's death, actually in 2016, pointed out where the term Minnesota Miracle came from. It was coined by the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations in the title of its report, which stated, now I'm reading this because I think it goes complete contrary of what these articles that we're seeing actually says. This initial definition says, Minnesota lawmakers and governor may well claim the Outstanding Fiscal Performance Award of 1971 for their effort to provide a rational state-local fiscal system. By assuming a dominant role in state-local fiscal policymaking, they intended to reduce the fiscal disparities among school districts, strengthen the general fiscal position of cities and counties, and ease the burden of property taxes on homeowners and business firms. In that process, they made Minnesota a model for other states to follow. So again, keep that in mind as we move forward with this conversation regarding all of these national stories, because again, I think that what was done in this session would make these 1971 Democrats roll over in their graves. So I'm going to throw it to you here. What's your take on these articles, the attention Minnesota and our recent legislative session is getting nationally, especially when it comes to some of the applause and accolades versus criticism of what got done this session?
Well, I am not quite old enough to have been active in politics in 1972, but I did live in Representative Lyndon Carlson's district for quite some time. Crystal, depending on the year and when we were in redistricting, Lyndon Carlson had represented Crystal for quite some time, and he used to refer to the Minnesota Miracle all the time. So I had more than a passing familiarity with it. But I think one of the important things when you talk about the original Minnesota Miracle and what happened, it was really a structural reform of how the state and school districts are funded. And it was actually the reason why it was referred to as a miracle was that you had, and actually at the time, the legislature had the labels of liberals and conservatives instead of DFL and Republicans, because we didn't go into party designation until 1973, 2 years later. But in 1971, you had liberals and conservatives working together to basically say, hey, we need to change the way that the state is funded so that we produce a more sustainable state. And some of the things that we talk about today, fiscal disparities and LGA, are really kind of have their roots in the Minnesota Miracle and how we talk about, fiscal disparities is something we talked a lot about at the local level when I was in local government, because it was passed to stop suburbs from competing with one another with these ridiculous incentives to get corporate headquarters to build here instead of there, or things like that. And so basically, if the region does well, we all do well. And there's this whole formula about it, and you can argue about how well it works or how well it doesn't. But the point is that there was some thought and there was a blueprint to kind of what we were doing. What happened in the last legislative session was basically one party took control of both chambers of the legislature and the governor's office, and then just passed the laundry list of everything that they've wanted to pass for the last 10 years but haven't been able to, or sometimes in some instances more than that. And to your point, again, originally this was a miracle because you had people from both sides coming together and doing what was right for the state and trying to set the state on a long-term fiscal sound footing. And where this last session was anything but. I mean, the session, this was not a fiscally sound session. We blew through the entire surplus and then also raised taxes on top of that. So I think, from a marketing standpoint, it's sure great to run out and say, oh, look at us, it's the successor to the Minnesota Miracle, but it really is not in any way, shape, or form the successor to the Minnesota Miracle whatsoever.
I agree. I mean, and so first I want to give props to whether it's someone at the DFL or the state legislature. I mean, this is obviously something that's being shopped around, that's being picked up. So there are some, state Minnesota specific individuals or groups that are going and pitching this to some of these national stories. I mean, I would like to think that they all just came to this understanding themselves, but as being a former comm staffer, I know that is likely not the case. So one of the articles I just want to list out, because I think that, even now, just being less than a month removed from the legislative session, we kind of forget some of the things that really came out. And so in one of the National Review's articles, Minnesota's lurched to the hard left, the theme is, quote unquote, they went woke. So we've been paying attention, but after reading this article, it is a kind of telling, just or maybe exhausting to look at exactly what they did this term. Late term abortions, license and healthcare for all, whether in the state country legally or not. Radical ethnic studies curriculum, bias registry, paid family leave, carbon free by 2020, gun control, free lunches, expanded election laws, including felon voting. I mean, the list goes on of the things that they accomplished in this. Of course, the ridiculous spending spree being a big part of that. And as you mentioned, I did talk to some colleagues here, and that was the biggest frustration I've heard of folks is not even just what they got done, but the fact, as you mentioned, that they got all this done with no bipartisan support, which sure, the Democrats have full control. They don't need it, nor do they really care what the Republicans think. But isn't this kind of what how government is supposed to function, how we're supposed to, operate as a democracy, as a society, that we come together, have these conversations and do this? I mean, I think that that's one thing that I feel is missing from a lot of these national articles is the even just, asterisk saying no Republicans voted on any of these things that were passed. Or not only did they not vote on it, but they were not allowed to debate. They were not allowed to give their input. They were not allowed to testify in a lot of these things. And I think that should be noted.
And I think it's exactly the opposite, as we were talking about in the beginning here, of what the Minnesota Miracle embodied, which was good government. I mean, they were being Minnesota was being praised for having good government. There's nothing good government about what you saw here, things being passed in the middle of the night. We had former Representative Keith Franke on a few weeks ago talking about the gutting of the e-pull tabs and how that happened literally in the 11th hour. With language that had never been seen in committee. Nobody ever got the chance to debate or testify on, and it just happened. That's not good government. I wanted to talk about, I wanted to do a little compare and contrast here, because I think the other thing that's interesting is that you've got this kind of fawning national press about Minnesota and what Minnesota accomplished under all Democrat control. And you have exactly the opposite going on in Florida. And for a number of reasons, I think you don't get to see, whether it's the national press's hostility to Republicans in general, or I think a lot of it really has to do with the fact that Ron DeSantis himself is seen as a presidential contender. Therefore, even some conservative or Republican-leaning type news organizations don't want to necessarily go out and seem like they're propping him up too much. But I actually wanted to say I've got a list here of a couple of things that happened. I mean, so Florida has a Republican-controlled legislature in both chambers and then a Republican governor, and they had what they consider a very successful legislative session as well, but nobody's calling it the Florida miracle, whether that's a failure of DeSantis and his team for kind of putting that out there, or they're just not that creative, or maybe they've got another clever name for it. But as you mentioned, you went through a few of these already, but in Minnesota, they removed all restrictions on abortion. In Florida, they passed the Heartbeat Protection Act. In Minnesota, they spent the entire surplus and added a ton of new taxes. Florida cut taxes by $2.7 billion. Minnesota refused to exempt baby strollers, car seats, and cribs from sales tax. Florida passed new exemptions on diapers, wipes, cribs, and strollers, permanent tax exemptions. Minnesota, as we talked about before, made themselves a sanctuary state where parents can hide children based on this gender identity treatment and all those things. Florida banned the use of puberty blockers in minors. In Minnesota, we still don't have fully funded education, despite the big handouts to the teachers' unions. Florida passed universal school choice. You mentioned gun control. There were a couple of gun control measures that passed in Minnesota. Florida passed constitutional carry. You no longer need a permit to carry in public in Florida. And I think when you look at that, we've seen also that Minnesota is losing population. Florida had the highest net in-migration of any state in 2022. And the other thing that's really interesting about Florida, we very, very much have a crime problem in Minnesota. All but I think the most stalwart Democrats will agree that crime is at a very high level and we have problems. Florida is actually at their lowest crime rate in 50 years. They've been tracking since the 1970s and using the same methodology, and they're at their lowest rate. So what's really interesting is you've got, we talk about states being the laboratories for democracy. You really have two sides of the coin, and you are showing people what does the Democrat vision of governance look like, and what does the Republican version of governance look like, and you can compare and contrast them, and we'll be able to see, I think, in the results in the long term how this turns out. I mean, I think it's a little too early to say, who has the more successful approach. And again, depending on your perspective, you may love the list from Minnesota and hate the list from Florida, or vice versa. But we definitely have the laboratory of democracy in full swing here, where you can see two states with very, very different approaches to governance and what that looks like. And I think we'll see, again, in the results over the coming years, who got it right, or who's got a more sustainable situation, or how this will turn out.
I think that's a really good point. I consider myself uh, a little bit more moderate on the Republican side. And so maybe there's some I would pick and choose from both of those lists of what I personally believe in. But I think it is interesting, as you mentioned, the amount of coverage from Minnesota and the lack of coverage from Florida, and whether that's a general bias or innate, maybe not willingness to prop up a presidential candidate with DeSantis. We previously discussed Walz and his national, claims and being propped up himself for potentially the future. But as you said, I think only time will tell, and I guess maybe if we're lucky enough to have another conversation about this in a year or two. All right, so
Second topic. Let's move on.
second topic. We are going to go on and maybe do a little circle back to a topic we talked to the other day. We are going to break down some recent troubles with local party unions on both sides of the aisle, the outrage and the damage that they can cause for the state party. So, Jeff, I'm going to lay this one out to you because I think we might have a little bit of a differing of opinions on things. We talked previously, remind folks a little bit, Minneapolis DFL dust up that we had a few weeks ago, and the recent situation with Scott County GOP and the chaos that came through.
Well, sure. First, before I get into the content of it, I'm going to break it down a little bit, because that's what we do here on the show. And feel free, as a former executive director of the Minnesota State Republican Party, to correct me if or add any more information. But I think people outside of politics don't necessarily understand what these party units are and how they operate. And so when you have in the state of Minnesota, there are two major political parties, the DFL and the Republican Party, and there is outlined in state law. There is a number of things that those parties have to do. They have to have a central committee, and they have to have these various kind of ways to organize across the state. And the political structure in Minnesota is very, I would say it is kind of naturally grassroots, in that there are local party units, whether they're organized at a county level or whether they're organized at a Senate district level. But these are groups of partisans that get together, and they are affiliated with the state party, in that they are, I guess, subunits of the state party. They are not overseen by the state party, right? So if you're the chair of Senate District 42, whatever, your boss is not the party chair. Ken Martin is not the boss of the people in Minneapolis, and David Hanna is not the boss of the people in Scott County, and that's not how it works. And so I think it's important to kind of set the stage on that, because it leads to some misunderstanding. So what happens is that these local groups get together and they elect their own leadership. And so you've got a chair of the Senate district, whatever, Republicans, or the Minneapolis DFL, or the Scott County, whatever. And they are accountable to the delegates who elected them. And each of these groups can go out and have their own website and Facebook page and go raise money and do all sorts of things, and can cause trouble, as we've seen, for the parent party, because it's not widely understood that Ken Martin can't just go fire the chair of the Minneapolis DFL, or David Hand can't go fire the chair of Scott County and tell them that they can't tell them what to do. It is, and I think as you were with the Republican Party as the executive director, I'm sure you ran into that in a number of instances where you have these party units who you can guide and you can cajole and you can yell at and you can use different methods, but ultimately they are independent, correct?
Yes. I mean, largely yes, somewhat no. I mean, so each, like you mentioned, each individual local party, whether it's a county, a house district, senate district, whatever that small breakdown is, has their own board, has their own chair, vice chair, deputy chair, whatever their breakdown is. They have their own individual constitution, bylaws, everything of the sort. However, it's kind of like the state and country, right? We do what we want at the state level, but we still kind of have to comply with federal laws. I mean, we can make our own, like let's say medical or legalization of marijuana, right? We have our it's legal here in Minnesota, but still technically illegal. So it's kind of similar in this facet of the state party still can dictate different things. They can make different rules of delegates that are coming to the state party convention of whether you're able to or not, or different endorsement rules. I mean, there are certain things you have to comply with the state party, but by and large, yes, each individual party can do what they want to do as long as it's relatively under the umbrella of what their parent party is wanting to do. But this is where I think we as a whole. So I mean, maybe why don't we chat about these specific instances? So we had.
Sure. So I would say, and one place where there is no clear, I guess, there's no clear line of command would be in messaging and communicating, right? So
Correct.
that's something where each group is going to go off and do whatever they want. And so what you had a few weeks ago was the chair of the Minneapolis DFL went out and said that the only good thing that Ronald Reagan ever did was died. And it was on the anniversary of his death, and it caused some outrage, and it should have, right? Because I think, everyone has their lines in what's appropriate and what's not, and I think most good thinking people can appreciate the fact that saying that the only good thing that a president ever did was died is on the other side of the line. Now, a few days later, because that's how these things go, the Scott County Republican Party went out on their Facebook page and posted a meme that compared Joe Biden to dictators throughout the ages, and said, this is what leaders who have their political opponents arrested: Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Joe Biden. Okay. Um, and now this is where I think we may get to a little point of disagreement, because I, honestly, I think comparing your political opponent to a dictator from history under the label of leaders who have their political opponents arrested is within the bounds of, now it's maybe kind of on the outer bounds, but I mean, it's, I guess I have a hard time getting really riled up about a comparison of Joe Biden to Stalin when, during the George Bush years, he was called Bush Hitler constantly. And I wish everyone would stop comparing everyone to Hitler. I think the cat's out of the barn on that one. I don't know that we're ever going to put that away. We probably, like, everyone would be better off if we just stopped with the Hitler comparisons altogether. But I think, comparing the person that you don't like politically to some other people politically is quite a bit different than saying the only good thing you ever did was died.
See, and I would kind of take it the other way. Like, sure, I think the other one was inappropriate. Wishing death or applauding death on anybody is great, is across the line in my book. Comparing a president. Now, I'm not a Biden fan. I'm not but comparing the president of the United States, Joe Biden, to a dictator who, under his reign, was responsible for the death of 6 million individuals, I would say is a little far, right?
So,
No,
so
that is the heart.
right, but they didn't say Joe Biden killed 6 million people. They said had their political opponents
I mean,
arrested.
read between the lines.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that there's lines to. It was fairly clearly a a comment on the indictment of Donald Trump and whether you think Joe Biden was involved in that, and they clearly do.
Let's bring up some hypothetical though. Like, let's say, oh, yeah, I'm not going to go into children because that's just I don't like to do that. But let's say your sibling or your neighbor came in and said, "I'm going to give you two things." This one, my neighbor pushed over my garbage can. I didn't like that. The neighbor on the other side murdered his wife and children. Like, I mean, like, there's a difference of variation, right? Between something that you don't like and is somewhat inappropriate versus murder. Like, come on.
So I guess where I see, and this kind of goes back to our conversation with Brian Strawser from a few weeks ago, I tend to take people at sort of what they say and not try to look for the hidden meaning in it. I mean, had they said, Joe Biden is a worse criminal than Hitler, I think, clearly that's a ridiculous comparison. But I guess saying dictators, the point to me was dictators arrest their political opponents. And I think that to a lot of people, what they're seeing right now is that the Department of Justice, which reports up to Joe Biden under the Constitution, had his political opponent arrested, and they don't like that. They don't like that. So was it the most artful comparison? No. And like I said, I'm not a I'm not a everybody should be compared to Hitler kind of person, but I also think we should put it into perspective. It's not like Joe Biden's the first person who's been compared to Hitler ever, or in the last several years, or I mean, right? So I think it's become sort of a standard thing that people do, which is obnoxious and annoying. But is it more obnoxious or annoying than some of the other things that people say? I don't know.
So I'll wrap us up here real quick and just go on my messaging rant. When you're explaining you're losing, and anything that I feel like Republicans in the state of Minnesota and nationally have a lot of good arguments to make about this. The steps that Democrats are taking, the steps that President Biden, that Governor Walz, that Democrats, the Minnesota DFL are taking. Things of this sort are a distraction and get the headline and soak up all of the air in the room so that reporters, our opponents, and even some in the middle can't look anywhere else towards our good arguments that we may or may not have or may not be articulating and are just focused, unfortunately, on this chaos and disaster and clickbait that we're creating ourselves. And so I think I told the story before, but when I was ED of the party, I cannot tell you, I mean, at least 3 conference calls that we had to have with party chairs, with party officers, with candidates, electeds, whatever it might be, saying, stop comparing the mask mandate to the Holocaust and Hitler. It is just, it's not any argument. You're not going to win. You're going to get that clickbait. You're going to ruin some of that credibility and goodwill that we're trying to get with having good policy principle stances. And that's just where I think going back to that messaging side, it to me is a distraction and really unfortunate when again these units that you can't control, that we don't have any quote unquote power over, have that ability, because the average person does not understand. I mean, just like you're a Republican, you are going to be lumped in with Trump and his policies, whether you want to or not, just because you have that R behind your name. And so
Uh,
that's my rant of the day.
No,
And
no
it's
disagreement at all from me on that one. I would like to think, if except for the obvious unconstitutionality of it, but I would like to think that you could get Ken Martin and David Hand to agree. State law banning local party units from using social media would be something that would be advantageous, as both parties have to deal with the constant distraction of kind of their worst. This actually goes back to the conversation we had with Walter Hudson probably a few months ago now, where you're always judged by the worst member of your crew, right? You're always judged by the craziest thing that somebody said, and then you're all going to get tarred with that same thing, right? And so I think, it certainly, as a former comms professional, you'd love it if everyone had the keys to their various social media accounts taken away, and you could craft the message every time. Unfortunately, again, besides it being unconstitutional, it just would never fly. But it's certainly, though, people rowing in the right direction and people messaging on the right points instead of going off on distracting things is a much better way to for that to work. Now, of course, I do enjoy it when it happens to the other side and then hate it when it happens on my side. So that's just one of those things, right?
Always. It's so it goes, and, unfortunately, it's not gonna be changing anytime soon, so I'll have my frustrations and we'll chat about them much more in the future.
And it'll be a perennial topic. We could do almost a weekly segment on who stuck their foot in their mouth this week, but uh, maybe that's a good one for when Michael gets back. All right, we'll move on to our next piece. All right, now it's time to welcome our guest of the week, who fits in with my theme of as in my time here as people that I know from Twitter but have never met in real life. One of my favorite follows on Twitter, Kyle Potter, who I one time thought his name was Kyle Potterman because his handle is Kyle Potter MN, and I really thought that MN was part of his name, but it is not. It is actually Kyle Potter. Welcome, Kyle Potter.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, so Kyle has kind of a cool background. He spent some time as a reporter covering the state government and politics with the Associated Press and Forum Communications, and now is the executive editor of a little place called Thrifty Traveler. So we'll get into some travel stuff in a little bit, but first we got to dig into the politics side of it because it is a politics podcast. So Kyle, set the stage for people a little bit. You were a reporter for how long?
First of all, I still consider myself a reporter. I just get to report on things that make people happy instead of make them angry and frustrated and want to tune out. But, prior to my joining my job, where I currently work, in just after the 2018 election, I had been, a reporter covering state politics for the Associated Press for just over 4.5 years, give or take.
Okay.
And then prior to that, kind of bounced around from a couple of different papers like Forum in Fargo, as well as some other kind of shorter term gigs around the country, really working at newspapers and trade publications.
Okay. And that was you actually answered my next question was going to be, do you consider yourself still a journalist today? Which you say you do. So that's good. I was just curious about that. You're certainly on a different beat, as you said, things that make people happy. So you covered, you were at the state capitol when you were covering politics, at least for a period of time. We had the previous segments here, we talked a little bit about how the last legislative session went and how it was a little bit different with the all DFL control. Do you still follow politics?
Yes and no. I mean, I feel pretty privileged in a couple of ways. First, I have the freedom to tune in and tune out as I want to, not just because it's not part of my job to pay attention anymore and pay attention as hyper closely as you're required to when you're a full-time reporter at the Capitol, but also because, look, I'm an upper middle class white guy. Paying attention to politics does not affect my daily life in a way that it does for many other people, where paying attention to the ins and outs at the Capitol can really, change lives. So, that gives me the freedom to care about what I want to and pay attention on Twitter. And probably most importantly, when I really feel like it, I get to say whatever the heck I want on Twitter about whatever is happening at the Capitol, which anyone who has followed me for the last almost 5 years since I switched from politics to travel could tell you is pretty rare, but it does happen.
Those are my favorites because you get a little peek behind the curtain. So one of the things that I wonder, I would love to quit politics and walk away forever and just never talk about it again. I can't seem to. There's a defect in my brain. So I just wanted to know if it was possible for somebody to kind of move on, because as when you're at the Capitol and you're actually in that world day in and day out, it's even worse than someone who's kind of almost a casual observer like me, and you're really into it. One of the things that I always thought was interesting is what's the phrase is familiarity breeds contempt. I think that's a famous phrase, right? I don't know that I've ever met a politician that the more I got to know them, the less I thought of them, or that didn't meet that, right? The more you get to know any politician, I think the less respect you kind of have for them. Maybe Becky has a different opinion because maybe you've worked for some good people, but or maybe she just wants to keep her mouth shut so she doesn't get in trouble. But I think, as you kind of the more you know, like kind of, I think regular people sort of have this feeling of, there's some corruption or sleaziness or whatever kind of backroom deals and all that stuff that happens in politics. And when you actually know what does go on, a lot of it is different than I think people think, but not necessarily in a better way, right? It's not like the corruption is different than how you think. And I think the scariest part for me is just how unremarkable some of the people who have these titles are, and when you spend lots of time covering them or spending, when the microphones are off and the cameras are off, you see those types of things. So do you want to dish on anybody or talk about how terrible it was to work at the Capitol, or
I'm not gonna punch down like that. No, look, it's
Are you gonna bite?
Look, I think the Capitol, I think every Capitol, whether it's Minnesota or Pierre, South Dakota, or DC, is a fishbowl, where what's happening inside the walls of your little glass container is the most important thing to every person out there, because you can't see the outside world. And look, that's not a knock against anyone that's doing what I used to do, because at the end of the day, I left because it was the right decision for me, not because it was a bad thing to do, or a horrible place. It was just really was just, I mean, the opportunity of a lifetime, quite frankly. I don't think I need to really explain that a whole lot. But I do think it doesn't take a whole lot of time to realize, once you're out of that fishbowl, that everything inside that place is magnified. That everything that happens is the most important event of that day, of that week, of that month, until the next event that happens. And once you're free from that environment, you get to process things in a different way. Not just from the perspective of, I'm a lobbyist and the email that my client sent me this morning is the most important thing that I need to do for the rest of my year, or I need to turn this, press conference into, a 500-word story as a reporter, whatever it is. You get to step back a little bit more, I think, and try to view things through the lens of, what does the average person really care about? And I think probably more importantly, what do they really need to know about? And that's, I think that's a really big challenge. And frankly, I think it's a challenge that a lot of reporters do a really good job handling. Narrowing in on the news that really does move the needle for average Minnesotans or Americans. But it's a really tough environment to be in, where you're constantly, have this flood of information from people who live and breathe this stuff constantly. So finding your way in that environment can be a little bit tricky. It certainly was for me, but just being out of it, even for a short while, made it really easy to step back and, honestly step away from it.
So I want to hit on a little bit about what Jeff said, and then also kind of lean into some questions here. I as you mentioned, sometimes they say don't meet your idols for a reason. I think there is something true to that, of sometimes when you're outside looking in and then you get inside, you are a little bit more jaded, maybe it's a little disillusioned by what's actually going on inside there. And as Kyle, as you mentioned, it is a fishbowl, and there are only a fragment of what is going on that is actually impactful to the general public. I too took a couple of years brief step away from politics, and I thought it was going to be ridiculously hard. And I gotta say, I loved it. I thought it was very freeing. I had way more time. I mean, I can only imagine. So this is my question to you. From my side of being an operative or being a politico and in working on campaigns or for government officials, it's really exhausting trying to consume everything that there is and know everything that you're supposed to know. But from your angle, you're getting pitched from legislators, you're getting pitched from candidates. You and I worked, I was able to work with you a little bit during the 2014 election when I was working for Mike McFadden and you were covering that. How were you able to not go crazy with everything coming in and trying to parse out what is important and what is not. And is it obviously you have to work with your editors and bosses on what to cover, but was that exhausting?
Yes and no. First of all, I'd probably make the point that I probably did go a little bit crazy because I left. That might be a better question for, Brian Baxt, who's been there for, almost 3 decades of how he's able to parse that. But no, it's a challenge. I think the answer is if you don't understand who your audience is, who your readership or your viewership is, you're not doing your job. So you need to know who those people are and the best way to reach them and what they care about. And that alone is a really difficult question. I think for me working where I did, it was maybe even a little bit more difficult to figure that out because, WCCO has viewers and you hear from viewers all the time. The Star Tribune has comment sections and email inboxes that get flooded, mostly for the worse, but probably sometimes for the better too, which helps you keep track of your audience. For a news organization like the Associated Press, reporters at state capitals at the Associated Press, in my experience anyway, don't hear a whole lot from readers because, the byline of an Associated Press reporter that gets reprinted in the Pioneer Press or the Star Tribune says something different to readers than it does, the reporters who work for those papers. But for where I worked, the emphasis was really on matters of statewide importance, which made it at least a little bit easier to tune out some of the noise about the things that everyday Minnesotans really just didn't need to care about,
like process down at the Capitol, which is everybody's favorite topic.
And that's the struggle is when the echo chamber is that loud, the pull, it has a gravitational pull of everybody else is writing this story. So you just get sucked into it. At the end of session, when everybody is in the exact same place, hungry for the single scrap of news that you're probably not going to get, but who knows? So you got to be there anyway. There's always that stuff, and it's unavoidable. It's part of why I left my job. Feeling like I could write every single story for May of name the year. And just kind of republish it. That level of repetition for me was just personally very exhausting and was a factor in why I decided to, make a big career change and do something different. But it's there, that is definitely a struggle, or at least it was for me.
Now, being on the outside looking in, do you find yourself, as a consumer of some of that news, do you find yourself a little bit more skeptical of what you read and maybe some of the tactics that a reporter might use to tell a specific story? Do you see through some of what you read, or do you just kind of absorb things as it's on its face and move on and try not to look too much into it?
Again, I have the freedom to choose what I care about for a number of reasons, and that is definitely one of them. I honestly, I have lived in a handful of different states. I have worked in newsrooms in a handful of different states. Minnesota newsrooms are not perfect, far from it. There is a lot of room for improvement, but the quality of journalism coming out of the state capital in Minnesota anyway is from where I sit really high. And grain of salt. I have friends who work there. I want to say that because that makes me feel a little bit better about myself too, because I spent a good chunk of my life there. But honestly, I don't really see the practice of political journalism in Minnesota a whole lot different than I did when I was there myself.
All right. So enough of the boring downer stuff. Let's talk about travel.
Yes, thank you.
I have a trip. I leave in a few days here for, so I'm excited. I didn't get a Thrifty Traveler deal on that one in particular. I did get to take my niece on the trip of her dreams to Paris maybe 2 years back, because of a Thrifty Traveler deal. So Kyle, tell us a little bit about what Thrifty Traveler is, and then what your particular role within the organization is and how that works.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, first of all, so glad to hear that you got to take your niece on the trip of her dreams. That is why all of us at the company do what we do. That's really the entire purpose, is to help people do things that they otherwise might not be able to afford to be able to do. So that is just amazingly gratifying to hear. So Thrifty Traveler is a Minnesota-based travel and flight deal website. So we really do two core things. The first is we run a service called Thrifty Traveler Premium, where you pay us a number of dollars each year for a subscription, and we send you flight deals from your home airport. You can get only deals departing from Minneapolis or St. Cloud or Brainerd or any number of the 200 plus airports in the United States and Canada that we search from. And we also offer kind of a tier of that service called Thrifty Traveler Premium Plus that also includes deals to use credit card points and airline miles. So that's the one half of it, which I am not real intimately involved with, though we're a small company and we all do everything together. The other half is, we run our website where we write guides and cover news in the airline and travel industry, trying to give people really a one-stop shop of the information that we feel like people really need to know in order to travel better and travel more often. So that's where I really come in, as executive editor of the website. My team and I of really great travel reporters and editors try to figure out every day what information people need to know, what additional guides we can write or republish to give people the best information to travel more for less. And it's really, really fun.
So I will say I'm a Thrifty Traveler evangelist of sorts at this point. I really enjoyed. We had not the fault of Thrifty Traveler, obviously, but I had booked a trip to Japan that I didn't get to go on because ultimately Japan ended up not being open from the post-COVID stuff quite at the time that the tickets were available, and they messed with the flight and added an extra segment and whatever, but it doesn't matter. But I always tell people it's kind of funny because I think there are a lot of what I would consider kind of scammy travel things out there, and so it's really hard to be like, okay, so whose guides can I really trust, and who can I trust in terms of taking this advice, and who's just kind of clickbait. And I understand, SEO and all that kind of stuff is part of what you do because you've got to be able to compete in that space. But I always tell people, but I kind of know the guy who writes it, and so it's okay. So I vouch for it in that respect. And really the fee is not, there's an annual fee. I don't know what it is, but it's not much. You'll make it up on one trip if you find one flight deal. So I just wanted to, again, I really enjoy the service, and it's the only thing I think that my only complaint is really that I don't have enough money. I just don't have enough money to go on all the trips I want to. And so when a city comes up or something and it's like, oh, we could go, and I'm like, okay, but we already kind of have our summer travel booked, or, oh,
Right.
we already did our flights for this year, but do you think we could squeeze in one real short trip to, whatever?
Yeah.
Hey, what about a week in Rome just because a real good deal just came by? And so it's, deciding which one of them to actually jump on is part of the game. I think that's maybe a little bit stressful, but in a good way, I guess, because
Yeah.
how
Well,
do you maximize your leisure?
right. Well, I mean, you have two options. You could take a long weekend in Auckland, New Zealand, which sounds great to, have a 14-hour flight and then spend, 12
Right.
hours on. Or, we could really look into adding, another service where we'll also negotiate with your employer paid time off and also, maybe additional holidays for your kid's
Right.
school district. But
Right.
that is
Let's
going to
go
be
here.
substantially more expensive.
Thrifty Traveler Premium Plus Supreme. That's where we're going. Anything we need to know about summer travel, Kyle, this year? I know you can't get to Europe for cheap because it's all sold out. That's what I read.
It is going to be one for the record books, honestly, in just about every respect. I mean, this is the first summer where, Americans have had clarity about what travel was going to look like, because, this time, a year and change ago, a lot of Europe was either still shut down or shut out to travelers, or had, testing or COVID vaccination requirements for entry. This time last year, there were still a requirement to test negative in order to fly back to the United States, which meant that any trip to Europe, or anywhere out of the country for that matter, you were running the risk of getting quarantined abroad for, 10 plus days beyond when you were supposed to return home. So people just put off those big trips, in 2022. And now summer 2023, the world is basically wide open. People are coming out of the woodwork with the money that they saved because of those canceled flights to Japan, and putting it towards making up for lost time. Their business travel still isn't where it was prior to the pandemic, but the everyday Americans who are taking vacations that they put off for 3 years is more than making up for it. So airports are going to be nuts on either side of the pond. Airplanes are going to be incredibly full. Europe is going to be incredibly expensive and crowded, especially if you're going, between now and say mid to late August. The only upshot here is that we're seeing something that we haven't seen in a couple of years, which is that domestic airfare within the United States this summer is as cheap as I've personally ever seen it. It doesn't mean that you're going to find a cheap flight no matter where you're looking. But there are deals out there if you're a little bit flexible, both in terms of, which day you depart on and which place you're looking to go. I mean, flights that used to be $500-$600 round trip within the United States, we've seen drop as low as like $96 round trip nonstop from Minneapolis. I mean, those are prices that were just unthinkable even before the pandemic. So as with anything, there's always a little bit of a silver lining. The silver lining to a record-breaking, probably chaotic summer travel season is the fact that if you haven't planned something yet, you can probably still get a really good deal if you're looking to stay closer to home.
Hey, you can get to Detroit for like $99 if you want to go to Detroit for some reason.
And you want to fly Spirit? Sure, yeah. You go ahead, Jeff.
Big bucket list. I got 2 quick questions. One, is it true that we should book our travel on Tuesdays, or is that made up?
Thank you for asking, so I can tell you no. That is made up. It's not true. Now, look, airfare is really complicated, and I think what I've learned most working this job is people really like simple solutions to those complicated questions. And the honest answer is that there probably was a time where Tuesdays were the best day to book flights, before the days where basically every single airline was digitized and they were, just uploading fares through, not just, through their computers, but through, a software algorithm, basically. But for the last, probably at least 2 decades, there's really nothing to the idea that you're going to get the cheapest flight booking on a Tuesday. I will sing it from the rooftops. It won't do any amount of good, but I just hope that anyone listening knows that you can't count on a good deal just because you're searching on a Tuesday.
Perfect. And my last question before we move on, because you're sticking around for our food fight, is my husband and, well, we're already married, but we're having our big ceremony at the end of this year, December. We're looking to do maybe a trip next spring or summer. When is there an ideal time to book, like months? Is it better 4 months in advance, 6, 8 months in advance? Is there some sort of time frame with that you could recommend? Because it's all about me here.
Well, first and most importantly, congratulations, even if you're already married. That's a really tough one, because the only capital T true answer I can give you is that the best time to book is when prices are low, which is the least helpful answer. The biggest thing is if you're looking to go somewhere abroad, booking, I would say at least 60 days in advance, probably 60 to 90 days in advance is the key, because once you get a little too close to departure, airlines know that the people who are looking at those flights are more willing to pay because they're planning fairly last minute and maybe don't have a choice on whether or not they're taking that trip. But there's really no guaranteed sweet spot for when you're going to get the cheapest price. The best thing that you can do is, whether you're looking, 90 days from now or 9 months from now, use Google Flights, set a Google Flights price alert for, the destination that you're looking at so that you get an email when prices have dropped on the route that you're looking to take. And, if you get that email and it drops to a price that you're comfortable paying, book now. Book at least a main cabin economy ticket, not the cheapest basic economy ticket, because if you book main cabin and the price drops again, you can rebook that flight that you just paid for and pocket the difference after fares drop as an airline credit that you can use to put towards your next trip.
Love it. Huge tips. We'll take them. All about that, and sign up. Where can people follow you and find out all the tips of the trade for their Thrifty Traveler?
Yeah, I am not K Potter Man. I am K Potter MN on Twitter and pretty much every other social. But Thrifty Traveler is at thriftytraveler.com and just Thrifty Traveler on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, wherever else you find travel companies and influencers that you follow or tune out.
Fantastic. So I have to confess, I'm only doing this guest host gig for a short period of time until Michael comes back. And I had a couple of food fight items that I wanted to do, and Taco Bell menu items was one of them. And I know that Kyle is a fellow Taco Bell aficionado. So there was kind of a dual purpose to inviting you here, because it got to force the issue of doing the Taco Bell menu item list. So Becky, we're going to move on into the food fight with Brodkorb and Becky, except for it's with me and Becky, and then also Kyle Potter. And the topic this week is Taco Bell menu items. And as I clarified, these can be either existing current Taco Bell menu items or discontinued menu items, in case you have a love long gone. Kyle, why don't you go first? We go from number 1, your favorite, to number 5, and just kind of a rapid fire here. So go ahead. What's your number 1?
The number 1 Taco Bell menu item, indisputably, is the grilled cheese burrito,
Okay.
which is not what it sounds like, but it is the best burrito that you can get at Taco Bell. They just kind of like fry some cheese on the outside in like a little quesadilla grill or something. I don't know. It comes on and off the menu. It is incredible. In fact, it's so incredible, it's better than the number 2 item in my books, which is the Crunchwrap Supreme.
Oh, we're not ready for number 2. We got to go.
Okay. All right. Well,
sorry, round robin.
Nobody heard that, and we'll move on.
Becky, what's your number 1?
Okay, so my number 1, I am a child of the 90s. I'm going Chilito all the way.
Yeah, you are correct. Kyle is wrong. My number 1, also the chili cheese burrito / mega cheese chilito, which is just a souped up version of the chili cheese burrito. But that is the indisputable menu item. Kyle, what's your number 2? I'm thinking Crunchwrap Supreme.
You're correct. For the first time ever, you're hearing from me that the number 2 item is Taco Bell's Crunchwrap Supreme. There's a reason why it has inspired many duplicates, some of which are quite good, others which are very terrible. But yes, number 2, Crunchwrap Supreme.
Becky.
My number 2, I'm just going plain old chicken quesadilla. Pretty much got me through college. I probably had that no less than 3 meals a week in college, if not more. There was one on campus, right outside my dorm. I mean, come on.
Fantastic. Soft taco is number 2 for me. Just the classic soft taco. Usually best late at night when you just are looking for simplicity. Just the straight soft taco. Kyle, what's your number 3?
Not even Supreme?
So Supreme, okay, but I don't like the tomatoes. So then with sour cream, but no tomatoes, I didn't want to make it complicated. So I just said soft taco. What's your number 3, Kyle?
My number 3 is the Baja Blast.
Okay.
A little bit out of the ordinary. Probably weren't expecting a whole lot of beverages, but if Baja Blast can only get it at Taco Bell, my personal favorite is to do like half Baja Blast and half standard Mountain Dew. It looks a little bit like antifreeze and something you shouldn't be drinking.
Fantastic.
But it's very good.
I have to tell you, I was in Las Vegas a few weeks ago, and the Las Vegas Cantina on the Strip actually has alcoholic versions of most of those freezy things that they have.
They sure do.
Definitely worth a visit. Becky, your number 3.
Yet another discontinued and one that is just mind-blowing to me that they would ever think to get this off, border fries. I mean, come on. I love
Yeah.
potato Lays are great, but Taco Bell far superior. So border fries, bring back.
I can't argue with that. Mine is also a discontinued menu item, the Big Beef Mexi Melt. If you ever never had a Mexi Melt, it is seasoned ground beef, three cheese, which is a different kind of cheese. It's not just the regular cheddar cheese; it's a three cheese blend, and then the pico, which is also discontinued. So Taco Bell killing me here, but that used to be a real staple of mine. Was a chili cheese burrito, a beef Mexi Melt, and a soft taco was the lunch of champions back in the day. Kyle, what's your number 4?
Number 4 is the Doritos Locos Taco. It's not very often that these kind of items stick around for as long as that has. It feels like it's been about a decade, but I think it's earned its place in the top 5.
I don't hate that at all. My number 4 has already been said by Kyle's number 2, Crunchwrap Supreme, baby.
All right. My number 4, the Cheesy Gordita Crunch. It is it's got a layer of cheese in the middle between the gordita shell and the taco shell. It just, you can't go wrong. It's like a flavor overload. All right, Kyle, the last number on your list.
Number 5 epitomizes every feeling I have about eating at Taco Bell, which is generally, should I be eating this? And that is the Nachos Bel Grande. It looks horrifying, I will admit that, but it is very, very good.
It's also about 6 pounds worth of nachos too.
Correct.
Which is sometimes you just need it.
So I need to remind people that we don't discuss these ahead of time. We don't have any conversation, text, email chain, anything about this. My number 5 is Nachos Bel Grande, but specifically no beans. I prefer to take no beans and add some lettuce to it. But man, oh man,
no beans is always the right choice, in my opinion. My number 5 is actually a little bit of a twist on what Kyle said earlier, but mine is the Cool Ranch Doritos Locos Taco Supreme, which was discontinued. And I don't know if you've been following Taco Bell news at least as closely as I have, but they have been doing a thing lately where they allow people to vote on menu items that can return from the dead. And the Cool Ranch Doritos Locos Taco Supreme was up against the Beefy Crunch Burrito, which I don't even know what that is. Apparently the Beefy Crunch Burrito won. That'll be back in August. I guess we're going to have to wait for the Cool Ranch Doritos Locos Taco Supreme to come back. I don't know. It's disappointing.
I gotta say, I'm a little surprised no Mexican pizzas. It's not my jam, but I'm surprised.
Yeah, it doesn't.
I asked my wife before we started to record, and that was her number 1. Actually, was the Mexican pizza. She's like, "Well, Mexican pizza for sure." And I'm like, "Oh, I didn't have that on my list. I wonder, can we stay married? I hope so."
Well, I hope you can as well.
That would be a way to go out, though. Over a dispute of top 5 Taco Bell items. It wouldn't be the first.
My wife's one of her first jobs was at Taco Bell. So we have kind of a shared long taco history in our marriage. So love of tacos is one of the things that brought us together. So, all right. Well, thank you very much, Kyle Potterman from Thrifty Traveler. Thanks for being with us. I really appreciated the conversation today. And follow Kyle at Thrifty Traveler or Kyle Potter MN. For all of your travel needs and the occasional snarky political take.
Thanks, guys. This was a lot of fun.
All right. Thanks, Kyle. See ya.
Bye.
Well, another fast and furious interview. Great conversation. Appreciate you reaching out to Kyle for joining us. It was a fun flashback for me. It's been almost 10 years since I ran into him on the political trail. So nice work.
How can it be that long?
I know, right? Well, we're going to move real quick into our tweet of the week. Why don't you kick us off here, Jeff?
So my tweet of the week is actually from a former, one of the guests that we had on a few weeks ago, Jan Unstead, and it was a Father's Day tweet, and which I thought was really, really cool. Jan had um, an article from the Star Tribune, and I'm trying to see if I can see the year on this. I don't see a year, but it's definitely 1953, October 18th, 1953, where her dad was featured in a little blurb in the Star Tribune under something called Bowler's Bazoo. And it says, "This is a little story as refreshing as the autumn weather. A year ago, Clayton Unstad was stricken with polio at the start of the bowling season. According to Clar Anderson, Audi Bowl proprietor, Unstead was bedridden for several months before he was able to get around on crutches. Last Saturday night, the Audi Bowl Mixed Doubles League started again, and Unstead was there. Still on crutches, he's put one aside to throw the ball, and he did extremely well, shooting 108, 173, 101. How is that for persistence?" So an amazing little story about Jan's father bowling with crutches. Can't get better than that.
Without crutches, I think it's a win if I break 100. So not perhaps. My tweet of the week is a quote tweet. So the original tweet said, "Apple will stop autocorrecting swear word to ducking." And my friend, the famous John Rouleau, tweeted about ducking time. And I agree. Simple. Love it. Funny.
I've been hit by the ducking more times than I can count.
Whoa, it's always frustrating too. So to wrap things up, we want to thank you for listening to the Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky featuring Jeff Kolb. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also leave a review on our website at bbreakpod.com. Again, that website is bbreakpod.com. You can also find us on Twitter at bbreakpod. Again, that is bbreakpod on Twitter. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky and Kolb will return next week. Have a great week.
Have a great week.